This is the story of Noah Bennett and his wife Madison Bennett. A woman named Madison submitted. No, wait, this one came from the husband. Noah sent this in about 3 weeks ago, and I'll be honest, I sat with it for a while before deciding to include it here. He wrote it in pieces, like he kept stopping and coming back to it. You can feel that in the way it reads. He said it started as a marriage story, the kind we get all the time, but somewhere in the writing he realized it had become something else entirely, something he still doesn't fully understand. According to him, the last clear memory he has of Madison as his wife was the afternoon she slid a manila envelope across the kitchen table, smirked, and said, "You're not going to fight this, are you?" He didn't, and for months he thought that was the end of it. Then she disappeared. Here's how he told it. I'll try to explain it the way I remember. Not the way it ended, but the way it started, 'cause I think that matters. I think if you only hear the last part, you'll miss the whole thing. And the whole thing is what keeps me up at night. The kitchen light in our apartment flickered every morning between 7:14 and 7:20. It had done that for almost 2 years. Some kind of loose connection in the fixture, the landlord said. He'd fix it. He never did. And somehow that 6-minute flicker became part of the rhythm of our mornings. The coffee maker gurgling, Madison's phone buzzing on the counter, the light stuttering overhead like it was deciding whether or not to commit to the day. I used to watch her in that light. The way it caught the side of her face when she leaned over her phone, scrolling through whatever she was always scrolling through before she'd had her coffee. She had this habit of pressing her thumbnail to her lower lip when she was reading something that interested her. Not biting it, just pressing. I don't think she ever knew she did it. I never told her. We'd been married 4 years at that point, together for 6. Madison was the kind of woman who took up space in a room without trying, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the way that when she left, you noticed the air was different. She was sharp and put together in a way that made people assume she had things figured out, and she mostly did. She had a career she'd built herself, a network of professional contacts she tended to like a garden, a very specific idea of what her life was supposed to look like. I admired that about her. I still do, in the abstract, detached way you can admire something that no longer belongs to you. What I didn't fully understand back then, in the kitchen, in the flickering light, was that I was becoming a background detail in the idea of her life, not a person she was building something with, a fixture. Like the light itself, present enough not to notice, flickering enough to eventually need replacing. I'm getting ahead of myself. We met at a conference in Denver. I was there for work, project management for a mid-sized logistics firm, nothing glamorous. She was there representing a financial consulting group she'd recently joined. She walked up to me at the drink table, not because she was interested in me initially, I think, but because I was standing near the only cold water, and she didn't want to make it weird by reaching past me without saying something. So she said something, and then I said something. And 4 hours later, we were in the hotel bar, splitting a bottle of wine, and she was telling me about her father, who had built and lost 2 businesses by the time she was 12, and how she had decided somewhere around age 15 that she would never let money make a fool of her the way it had made a fool of him. That sentence should have told me everything. But I was 31 and she was laughing, and the light in that bar was the warm amber kind that makes everything feel like the beginning of something good. So I filed it away under ambition and drive and things I find attractive, and I didn't look at it again for a long time. We married 3 years later in a small ceremony in Connecticut, her home state. It was exactly the kind of wedding Madison wanted. Curated, tasteful, 37 people, excellent food, no DJ. My family is from Ohio, loud and prone to dancing badly, and they behaved themselves remarkably well, my mother cried. Madison's mother looked pleased in the controlled way that people look pleased when something has gone according to plan. The first year was good. I want to be honest about that. The first year was genuinely good. We cooked together on Sundays. We argued about movies in a way that was actually playful. We drove up to Vermont in October and stayed in a bed and breakfast where the owner had 17 cats, and we laughed about it for weeks afterward. She used to fall asleep on my shoulder watching television, and I would wait until she was completely out before I turned the volume down, because I didn't want to wake her. Small things. The kind of small things that don't photograph well, but that you carry around inside you. The shift was gradual. That's the hardest part to explain, because there was no incident. No affair I discovered, no argument that cracked something irreparably. There was just the slow accumulation of distance, measured in small degrees. The way you don't notice a room cooling until you realize you've been cold for a long time without identifying it. Around the second year, Madison was promoted, a senior consulting position, more travel, more responsibility, more of everything she had spent her adult life engineering toward. I was proud of her. I told her that. But pride, I learned, isn't the same as presence, and presence was what she was increasingly giving to everything except us. She started coming home later. Not suspiciously late, an hour, sometimes two. She'd eat if there was food left, or she'd eat whatever she'd grabbed on the way home. Standing over the counter in her work clothes, scrolling through her phone, and I would sit at the table and try to find a way into her day. I'd ask how it went. She'd say fine, or busy, or actually kind of interesting. Can I tell you tomorrow? I'm exhausted. Tomorrow would come, and I wouldn't bring it up, and she wouldn't bring it up, and we'd move on. I started filling the quiet in ways I didn't consciously recognize at the time. I read more. I started running in the mornings, which I hadn't done since college. I called my brother more often. I told myself this was healthy. I told myself this was two people with full lives maintaining their individual identities within a marriage, which was supposed to be the mature and modern thing. I was lying to myself, but softly, gently, the way you lie to yourself when the truth is something you're not quite ready to pick up. It was around this time that Madison mentioned Caleb Price for the first time. She said his name the way you say the name of a colleague, matter-of-factly, embedded in the middle of a sentence about something else. Caleb thinks the Hargrove account could go either way, which, he's usually right about these things. I registered the name and didn't reach for it. A few weeks later, Caleb was in the Chicago office last week. Apparently it's a nightmare over there. And then, I ran into Caleb at the thing on Thursday. He said hi, to me, through her. A man I'd never met. I'm not saying there was anything between them. I want to be clear about that, because this story is going to take a direction that might make it easy to assume, and I don't want to assume, even now. What I noticed was simpler and more uncomfortable than suspicion. When Madison talked about Caleb Price, it changed slightly. Not warmer, exactly. More animated. More present. The way it used to sound when she was telling me about something that had actually caught her attention. I noticed. I said nothing. I filed it away. The thing I've come to understand about marriages that unravel quietly is that they don't fail in one moment. They fail in all the moments where someone noticed something, swallowed it, and went back to normal. We were very good at going back to normal. Normal was our default, our refuge, the thing we'd retreat into when anything threatened to become a real conversation. One evening in October, 3 years into the marriage, I think, maybe early in the fourth, Madison came home and she was different. Not upset, not cold. Just slightly off, the way someone is when they've made a decision they haven't told you about yet. She set her bag down, went to change out of her work clothes, came back in jeans and a sweater, poured herself a glass of wine, and sat across from me at the table where I was working on something for the office. She asked how my day was. I told her. She listened, she nodded, then she said, "Do you ever feel like we're just running out the clock on something?" I looked up. She was looking at the table, not at me. Her thumb was pressed to her lower lip. I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Never mind, I'm just tired." And we went back to normal. But the question hung in the air between us for weeks afterward. I could feel it in the mornings, in the flickering light. I could feel it in the silences that had stopped being comfortable and started being occupied, filled with things neither of us was saying. I should have said, "Yes, tell me what you're feeling. I'm feeling it too." Instead, I said nothing because nothing felt safer than something. And in marriages that are beginning to dissolve, safety is very often the thing that accelerates the dissolving. I should have said something. I didn't. November turned to December, and we moved through the holidays with a careful, coordinated pleasantness that I think we both understood was performance. Her family came for Christmas. My brother and his wife drove down from Ohio. There were meals and gifts and the kind of laughter that happens around tables when the alternative is acknowledging the silence underneath. Madison was warm that weekend. Present, even. She laughed at my brother's stories, helped my sister-in-law in the kitchen, stayed up late with her mother watching old movies. I watched her from across rooms and thought, maybe I was reading too much into it. Maybe tired and distant is just what long marriages look like from the inside. Maybe everyone feels this way and no one talks about it, and that's just the deal. I wanted that to be true. I wanted it badly enough that I let myself believe it for a little while. January came and we returned to routine, and the routine by now had its own texture, carefully maintained, comfortable on the surface, hollow underneath. Madison was traveling more. Long weekends in cities I'd visit on a map after she left. Austin, Phoenix, Boston, once to London for a week. She would text regularly, which I appreciated, but the texts were informational rather than connective. Flight delayed, hotel is fine, dinner ran long. The kind of updates you send someone to satisfy an obligation rather than because you wanted to share the moment. I started noticing the apartment differently when she was away. The way it felt neither emptier nor fuller, just the same. Like her presence and her absence had become approximately equivalent. I sat with that observation for a long time one night, and then I turned on the television and went to bed. There was a Tuesday in February I keep returning to. She'd been in Boston for 3 days and had come back that afternoon. I'd made dinner, nothing elaborate, pasta, a salad, the garlic bread she liked. She came in and set her bag down and said the apartment smelled good and sat down at the table. We ate. She told me a little about the meetings. I told her about something that had happened at my office. She laughed in the right place. Then, near the end of dinner, she said, "Caleb's thinking about starting his own firm, leaving the company." I said, "Really?" She said, "Yeah. He's been talking about it for a while. I think he might actually do it." I said, "What kind of firm?" She said, "Boutique consulting. Specialized. High-yield investment structuring, that kind of thing. Riskier clients, bigger returns." I said, "Sounds like him," which was a strange thing to say since I'd never met him, but she didn't react to it. She said, "He wants me involved. The pasta was good." I remember that specifically because I remember looking down at my plate and noticing it and thinking, "This is good pasta," and using that to fill the second of silence before I said, "Involved how advisory capacity initially? Maybe more, depending on how it develops. At the same time as your current job?" "No," she paused, a deliberate pause. Instead, I looked up then. She was watching me with an expression I'd seen before but couldn't quite categorize. It sat somewhere between expectation and preparation, like she was waiting for me to say something she'd already scripted a response to. I said, "That's a big decision." She said, "I know." I said, "Have you been thinking about this for a while?" She said, "A little while, yeah." I said, "Were you going to tell me earlier or I'm telling you now?" "Not I was going to. Not I should have sooner. I'm telling you now, like the timing was simply a logistical fact rather than a choice." I nodded. I asked a few more questions, practical ones, about finances, transition timelines, risk factors. She answered them crisply and well. She'd clearly thought it through. She didn't ask what I thought. I don't think she considered that a necessary part of the conversation. After dinner, she went to her office to respond to emails, and I did the dishes, and I stood at the sink for longer than the dishes required, letting the water run warm over my hands, and I thought, when did I stop being someone whose opinion she needs? It wasn't a sudden thought. It was the surfacing of something that had been rising for months. I dried my hands. I went to bed. I didn't bring it up again. I've replayed that dinner too many times. Not because it was the worst moment, but because it was the clearest. If there was a moment where I should have said, "Stop, hold on, I need us to actually talk," that was it. But I had a habit by then of deferring, of trusting that things would find their own level, of believing that the quieter and less confrontational I was, the less damage would accumulate. What I didn't understand was that silence is not neutral. Silence is a choice, and like all choices, it has consequences that compound. By spring, Madison was working with Caleb. Not full-time yet. She was still officially at her company. But there were phone calls at odd hours, closed-door conversations in her office. Trips, I understood, were connected to the new venture without being told explicitly. I was piecing things together from fragments, which is a disorienting way to live, like reading a book but only getting every third page. I tried once, directly, to have the conversation. It was a Saturday morning, mid-April, one of those pale spring mornings where the light is thin and the city is quieter than usual. She was on her laptop at the kitchen table, and I brought her coffee and sat across from her and said, "Can I ask you something honestly?" She looked up. "Sure. Are we okay?" She blinked. Once. Then she closed her laptop, just slightly, not completely. "Why are you asking that?" "Because I feel like we haven't really talked in a long time. Like actually talked." She considered this with the patience of someone who has a response prepared. "I've been under a lot of pressure with the transition. I know that. So I'm not blaming you for it. I'm just saying I miss you. I miss us talking." She looked at me for a moment and her expression did something complicated, something I couldn't fully read. Not coldness, not warmth either, something in between. Like I'd said something that landed somewhere she hadn't expected but that she didn't know what to do with. She said, "I'll try to be more present." I said, "Okay." She opened her laptop. I drank my coffee. The morning continued. She didn't try to be more present, or maybe she did and I couldn't tell the difference. Either way, the distance held. I wonder sometimes, and I don't know why I'm saying this, maybe it'll mean something to someone listening. like if this helps even one person say the thing they're sitting on. I wonder if the whole thing could have been different if I'd just pushed. Just once. Just said, no, I mean, are we actually okay? And I need a real answer, not a placeholder. But I didn't. Summer arrived, and with it a change in Madison's atmosphere that I couldn't ignore anymore. It wasn't dramatic. It never was, with her. But there was a confidence in her movements. Something new, elevated. She carried herself differently, smiled to herself at her phone, made plans without consulting me with an ease that suggested she'd stopped thinking of her life as something we were navigating together. Not cruel about it, just unconcerned. In June, she officially resigned from her company. She told me after the fact. She'd given notice, she said, 2 weeks ago. She mentioned it the way you mention a dentist appointment that went fine. She was calm, looked honestly like a woman who was stepping into a version of herself she'd been waiting a long time to inhabit. I said I was happy for her. I meant it. In the sad, complicated way you can mean something that also hurts. July was strange. She was working from home more, which should have meant we were together more, but felt like the opposite. She occupied the apartment differently. Earphones in, calls at all hours, papers spread across her desk, a kind of contained frenzy that had its own wall built around it. I'd pass by her office door and hear pieces of conversations, numbers, projections, client names I didn't recognize, occasionally Caleb's voice coming through the speaker, measured and assured. I started going running earlier to have somewhere to be. In late July, the 23rd, I think a Wednesday, she came into the living room while I was reading and sat across from me in the armchair that faced the couch. Not beside me, across from me. The furniture arrangement of someone about to have a formal conversation. She said, Noah, I put my book down. She said, I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I think I owe you honesty. The word owe landed strangely, like she'd been keeping a ledger. She said, I don't think this is working anymore. I didn't say anything right away. I looked at her, and she looked back. And for a long second there was something close to real between us. The realness of two people who have known each other well and are now sitting on opposite sides of something enormous. I said, Are you sure? She said, Yes. I said, Is there someone? No, this is about me, about what I need. I believe her for what it's worth. I believed her then and I believe her now. It wasn't about someone. It was about her. A clarity I think she'd been quietly arriving at for longer than the conversation had been in the open. I said, What do you need? She said, To not be in this. Quiet, not mean. Just honest in the particular way that honesty can be devastating. I said, I'd like us to try. I know you would. She said it gently. You'd try very hard. You'd be very patient. And it wouldn't be enough. And then we'd both be worse off. I didn't have a response for that. She wasn't wrong. She knew me well enough to know she wasn't wrong. She said she'd been speaking to a lawyer, that she had paperwork ready, that she wanted this to be clean and unburdened, and she didn't want it to become a war. She said she was fair, that she didn't want the apartment, that she'd already made arrangements to move into a place in Midtown, that the division of assets would be exactly as equitable as she'd promised it would be. She said, I need you to know this isn't a criticism of who you are. I said, It kind of is. She looked at me. Something moved through her expression that I couldn't name. Not guilt. Something adjacent to it, maybe. Or maybe just the last of whatever had kept her from doing this sooner. A week later was the kitchen table moment. The manila envelope. She slid it across to me, and her expression was confident. That's the word. Not mean, not triumphant. Confident, like someone who had done a difficult calculation and trusted the result completely. She said, You're not going to fight this, are you? And I looked at her, really looked at her, at the woman I'd watched in that flickering morning light for years. The woman who pressed her thumbnail to her lip when she was reading something interesting. The woman who'd cried at a movie once and then never talked about it after. And I said, No, I'm not. I signed the papers. She thanked me, genuinely, I think. Like I'd done her a kindness. She was out of the apartment within the month. She took what was hers, left what wasn't, and she did it cleanly, efficiently, with the same organizational precision she brought to everything. She texted me when the movers were coming. She left her key on the counter. She did not hug me on the way out. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the moving truck pull away, and the flickering light did its 6-minute thing overhead, and I thought, well, okay then. And here's the part I didn't expect to write. Here's where the story becomes something I still don't fully understand. The first months after Madison left were uncomfortable in the way that most silences are uncomfortable, densely populated with things you notice only because they've been removed. I reorganized the apartment without meaning to. I started buying different groceries. I slept in the middle of the bed and then, after a while, stopped thinking about it. I won't pretend I was devastated in any cinematic way. That would be dishonest. I was sad, a gray, ambient sadness, not acute but persistent, the kind that settles into the corners of things rather than the center. I went to work. I ran in the mornings. I called my brother more. I started cooking properly for the first time, following actual recipes rather than approximating. I heard from Madison occasionally. Clean, logistical exchanges, a document that needed a signature, a shared account that needed closing. She was professional and pleasant and completely contained. Every text she sent read like a corporate memo. I would respond in kind. We were very good at keeping it manageable. Around the 3-month mark, I started hearing things not from Madison. From the peripheral network of mutual connections that never quite fully severs after a marriage ends. A colleague who had met her at a conference. A friend of a friend who worked in finance. What I heard was fragments, impressionistic. Caleb Price's firm, which had launched quietly around the time of our divorce, was attracting attention, not positive attention. The kind of attention that comes from financial circles when someone is doing something that skirts the edges of legitimacy. I didn't know the specifics. I didn't pursue them. It wasn't my life anymore, and I was trying very hard to honor that. What I also heard, and this came from someone who knew Madison professionally, a woman named Diane who had worked with her for years and called me out of what seemed like genuine concern, was that Madison was in deep, not peripheral, not advisory capacity. She was involved significantly in whatever Caleb was structuring, and what Caleb was structuring was, according to Diane, the kind of thing that looked elegant on paper and catastrophic when it collapsed. I thanked Diane. I sat with the information for 2 days. And then I did nothing, because Madison was an adult, and she had made her choices, and I was not her husband anymore, and she had made that very clear. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, she missed a call from her mother. This does not sound significant. But Madison's relationship with her mother was one of the most consistent things about her. They spoke twice a week, Tuesdays and Saturdays, reliably, without exception, for as long as I had known her. Her mother called on a Saturday. Madison did not answer. Her mother called again that evening. No answer. She called Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. Her mother called me. I want to stop here and acknowledge that I almost didn't answer. We had no real reason to be in contact. But her voice, when I picked up, the careful control of it, the precision with which she was managing her own panic made me stay on the phone. She said, "I can't reach her." I said, "How long?" She said, 9 days, 9 days. I sat down. I said, "Have you called anyone else?" She said, "Caleb Price. I don't have a number." Her work contacts. She hasn't been responding to emails. Her building. They said her mail is collecting. Her mail was collecting in 9 days. I said I'd make some calls. What I actually did was call every contact I could reasonably reach, hitting walls with professional courtesy, no one alarmed, no one helpful. And then I did the thing I didn't want to do, the thing that felt simultaneously necessary and like a violation of something. I hired someone to look. Caleb Price, it turned out, was not difficult to find. He was in federal custody, had been for approximately 6 weeks, arrested in connection with what was being described, in the documents I eventually obtained, as a sophisticated investment fraud scheme, high net worth clients, international accounts, the kind of thing that gets quietly dismantled before it makes much noise in the news. Madison was listed in the investigation, not as a target, as a witness. Or she had been 6 weeks ago. Since then, her status had become something investigators were considerably less comfortable discussing. She wasn't under arrest. She wasn't not under arrest. She was, in the most precise and awful sense of the phrase, not located. I want to pause here and be honest about what I felt in that moment, sitting in my apartment with a folder of documents in front of me and the flickering kitchen light overhead. I felt afraid, not confused, not vindicated. Afraid in the cold, fundamental way that happens when something you thought was over reveals itself to be unfinished. I'd watched Madison slide those divorce papers across the table with the absolute confidence of a woman who understood her position completely, who had calculated the risks and found them acceptable, who had looked at me and seen someone she no longer needed and stepped cleanly away. That confidence, that particular, total, Madison Bennett confidence, was what made her Madison. It was what I'd admired and been exhausted by, and occasionally resented, and ultimately never stopped being drawn to. And somewhere in the past 6 months, she had apparently stepped off a ledge she didn't know was there. I didn't tell her mother everything. I told her enough that there was a situation involving Madison's work, that it was being looked into, that she should be in contact with a lawyer of her own, and that no news was not necessarily bad news. Her mother absorbed this with the same controlled composure that Madison had inherited from her and said, Tell me what you find. I said I would. What I found, over the following weeks, assembled from documents and conversations and one extended meeting with a federal agent who had no obligation to tell me anything, but seemed to have a human response to a former husband sitting across from him with no agenda other than to know, was a picture. Not a complete picture, an outline, the suggestion of one. Caleb's firm had been, from the beginning, structured around a strategy that was legal in its surface mechanics and illegal in its application, routing client funds through instruments that provided legitimate returns for a period while quietly siphoning margins into accounts that didn't appear on any disclosure. It had been running for roughly 14 months before federal scrutiny began. By the time the investigation had gained traction, the core of the operation had already begun to hollow out. Madison had come aboard in an advisory capacity, genuinely, at first. She had, and this, I believe, because I knew how she operated, not understood what she was getting into. She was sharp and careful, and she knew finance well, but she knew legitimate finance. She knew the structures Caleb presented her, and they were, from the outside, correctly constructed. She had not looked far enough inside, but at some point the agent suggested around the 9-month mark of the venture, she had understood, or understood enough. And the decision she made at that point was the one I kept returning to, turning over in my mind like a stone I couldn't put down. She hadn't come forward. She hadn't exited cleanly. She had, apparently, attempted to manage it, to quietly restructure her involvement in a way that removed her fingerprints while preserving as much of the financial gain as possible. It was an elegant strategy on paper. It was also the thing that had made her status complicated, where she was. The agent told me this with the careful language of someone who couldn't tell me more, was something they were actively working to determine. There was no evidence of harm. There was evidence of movement. International movement, which was, in the context of federal financial investigations, its own kind of message. I drove home from that meeting and sat in my car for a while before going upstairs. I thought about the woman who'd pressed her thumbnail to her lip in the flickering light. The woman who'd said, "I need you to know this isn't a criticism of who you are," and had almost meant it. The woman who had built every decision of her adult life around a determination never to let money make a fool of her, and who had, in the end, let the hunger for it steer her somewhere I couldn't follow. I thought about her mother and what it would be like to sit in a house in Connecticut waiting for a phone to ring. I thought about the smirk at the kitchen table, the confidence. "You're not going to fight this, are you?" I hadn't. And now I was sitting in a parking garage at 8 o'clock in the evening, trying to understand how the story gotten that table to here. How a woman who left with everything she'd planned for had somehow ended up in the category of persons whose location is being actively determined. I didn't go to the press. I didn't talk to anyone outside of necessity. I kept calling her mother on Tuesdays and Saturdays because it seemed like the right thing to do, even when I had nothing new to say. Her mother was gracious and exhausted and would always say, before hanging up, "You're a good man, Noah. I never knew what to do with that." The last thing I want to say is this. There's a version of this story where I'm the wronged husband and Madison is the cautionary tale, where her arrogance caught up with her and the universe settled the score while I lived quietly and correctly and was rewarded for my patience. I don't believe in that version. What I believe is this. Madison was a person who was extraordinarily gifted and genuinely afraid, and the fear never showed because she'd gotten very good at replacing it with forward motion. She moved toward things so consistently and so confidently that she never had to stop and examine whether the things she was moving toward were solid. She had mistaken velocity for wisdom and confidence for sight. And somewhere in the 6 months after she left our apartment with everything she thought she needed, the ground had given way. And I don't know where she is. That's the part of this that I can't resolve and can't leave behind. Not knowing. The story has no clean ending because the story isn't over. It's just stopped mid-sentence in a place I can't reach. I signed the papers. I let her go. I stood at the window and watched the truck drive away, and I thought, well, okay then, and I meant it. I had made my peace with the ending we were given. What I hadn't made peace with, what I sit with, still, in the apartment with the flickering light that no one has fixed, is the possibility that the ending I made peace with wasn't actually the ending. I keep the folder in the top drawer of my desk. I check my phone more than I used to. Some mornings around 7:14, the light starts its 6-minute stutter, and I stand at the counter with my coffee. And I think about a woman pressing her thumbnail to her lip in that same light, reading something that interested her somewhere I can't see. I hope she's reading something. I hope she's somewhere.